Hey guys, I'm back today today with another video. It is super late. It is 12:10 a.m. when I'm recording this on February 3rd, I think it is. So Murders at Karlov Manor have pre-releases have started. They started officially February 2nd. So for those of you who have done any pre-releases, congrats. Hope you guys got the stuff that you were liking. If you're new to the show, this is Cardboard Kitchen, where it's a podcast talking about MTG, specifically the Commander format, when possible. Originally done by players who play Commander, for players who play Commander in the Commander format, under the disposition that those of us who started it originally, we had different levels of experience playing the game. I having the most, because at the time I had almost 20 years worth, and it's been 4 or 5 years, something like that, since the group that originally got to doing it has been able to do it. So if you're new here and you're not subscribed, click subscribe, click the bell, be notified every time I upload something new. Leave your comments on the content if you like it, if you don't like it. If you want to see other particular things, I do have some stuff on the back burner that I'm trying to talk with some people about getting set up so we can get some more stuff squared away. But tonight, this morning, depending on where you are, what you want to call it, it's super late for me. I've been awake almost 24 hours. I think I got about 3 or 4 hours to go. It'll be like 24 hours. But this thought hit my head. So the last episode that I did, I talked about like cards you could use and things you could play to try and disrupt dredge players if you disliked the dredge mechanic. So what we're going to do now, or what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to talk about some cards to help against Brago King Eternal. So for those of you out there that play Brago King Eternal, I'm going to be giving away some secret tips and cards. Well, not so secret, but I'm going to be giving away some tips and tricks, maybe, for other players to try and kick your butts. But if you're watching and you play Brago King Eternal, that also means you're going to be aware of the things that they could be playing. So it also kind of gives you a leg up if you watch the content. So if anyone's unaware, Brago King Eternal says when it deals combat damage to a player, you may exile any number of non-land permanents you control and then immediately return those to the battlefield. So it'll let you blink things like Soul Ring, your mana rocks, your other creatures that maybe haven't entered the battlefield effect, all that kind of fun stuff. It just won't let you touch your lands. But I very, very often see the Brago King Eternal decks. I don't know. They consistently, for a blue-white deck, because Brago King Eternal is blue and white. It's actually specifically blue, white, and 2 generic. Those decks usually actually pop off quite quick. The fastest I've seen it is a turn 2 Brago with the what would be considered the Brago loop on like turn 4 with nobody having interaction. So that's actually quite quick for a casual deck. That's very, very annoying to try and deal with. It's like turn 1 land Soul Ring, turn 2 land Brago, turn 3 as many mana rocks as you can get Brago, blink those mana rocks plus Brago, play something else. Really kind of annoying to deal with, especially when you're like, oh, turn 4 Brago, play a extra turn spell and punch somebody with Brago, blink your mana artifacts, play a creature that comes in and lets you get your extra turn spell back, and then you're just going to loop infinite turns at that point and commander damage. It's very, very annoying. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go over some cards that you can use against this. So this particular loop does go, it can be as early as turn 4. If you're playing really like CEDH level mana rocks, it could actually probably be as early as turn 3. Because a lot of those mana rocks are 0 mana or 1 mana and produce a lot more and Brago allows you to not have to worry about the negative sides. Because the negative sides are usually they don't untap, and Brago forcibly untaps them, which is really dumb. So to start with, one of the cards you could use is a card called Plagiarize. Plagiarize is a 3 generic and a blue instant speed spell from the most recent set it's from is 10th edition. But it states, until end of turn, if target player would draw a card, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. So that's relevant because the Brago decks play, they play the tutors that they can play, which is not a ton because they're not playing, so they're not typically playing enchantments. So they're not playing Enlightened Tutor or Idyllic Tutor. They're predominantly winning through creatures, the creatures entering the battlefield, or taking extra turn spells and the creatures entering the battlefield to give them the extra turn spells back. So the tutors that they would be playing let them go fetch instants and sorceries, but there's not a ton of them. So other things that they can play are draw spells. Spells that are going to draw them, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plus cards a turn. So Plagiarize is really good because if they're like, oh, I'm going to cast if I'm going to cast a spell that's like Blue Sun Zenith, it's triple blue and X. So if they're like, I'm going to cast Blue Sun Zenith and draw 6 cards, you respond with Plagiarize, and instead what happens is for 4 mana instead of 9 mana, you're going to draw 6 cards, and they're not going to draw any of those cards. And then for the rest of the turn, so they'll get their 1 draw for the turn, but for the rest of the turn, actually no, it says until end of turn if target player would draw a card, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. So if they have a bunch of stuff in play like Staff of Nin that lets them draw an extra card and things of that nature like Howling Mine or something like that, if they've got a bunch of that stuff in, during their upkeep you could just cast Plagiarize, and then for their entire turn any card they would draw you're going to draw instead. So they don't get their card for the turn, they don't get the Howling Mine, they don't get the Staff of Nin. Some of them, I've seen a couple of them on the casual level play Font of Mythos, which is a 4 mana version of Howling Mine that draws 2 extra cards instead of 1, so it's 2 Howling Mines into 1 card. So like if they have all that in play, you're like, cool, during your upkeep I'm going to play Plagiarize, and then for the rest of the turn they're just not going to get to draw a whole bunch of cards, and all those extra draw effects that they have in play, you now get to draw off of those too, because they would get those draws, but now you're getting those draws instead. So that's a card you could use. It is a little expensive mana-wise. You can't play it until you have 4 available mana, and if the Brago player goes first at the table, you need to make sure you've got fast mana. You need to make sure that your turn 1 is like land, Soul Ring, and another 2-drop Mana Rock, so that on your next turn, on the next 2 or 3 turns, you have mana available to play the Plagiarize if you absolutely need to. The other thing is, and that's a blue card. So the other thing is they play tutors. And they play various things that tutors. They play creatures that will tutor for artifacts in their decks so that they can go get their artifacts like Soul Ring and stuff and get them into play. They play the tutors that will search up instants and sorceries and get them in their hands and all that fun stuff. So there's actually a red card you can also play, and it's an enchantment. It's a red enchantment called Stranglehold. It is 3 generic and a red. And it says your opponents can't search libraries. Now that's big, because it means your opponents can't play tutors now. Again, it's 4 mana, so if you want to get it as quick as possible, you probably need to have early game, like turn 1 Soul Ring, something else, so that you could play it on turn 2. It has a secondary effect, and the secondary effect is actually really good. It's just as powerful against Brago as the first effect, because the way Brago decks predominantly win for the most part is they get Brago, they get Mana Rocks, and then they get a creature that lets them get an instant or sorcery from their graveyard back to their hand when it comes into play, and they loop those creatures to get back extra turn spells. And the secondary effect of Stranglehold is if an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. So for 4 mana, you're preventing any tutor effects if it's early enough in the game. And then, assuming that they have stuff in their hand that lets them take extra turns, additional effect of if an opponent would, and this is the great thing, it says if an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. It doesn't say anything about all players. So you are exempt from the restriction of not getting extra turns. You as the player playing Stranglehold can take extra turns if you have ways that'll let you take extra turns through spells or other things. So Stranglehold's a really good option. And again, Stranglehold's in red. It's 3 generic plus 1 red. But it does give you 2 effects that are relevant against Brago, which is they can't search and they skip any extra turns that they would normally get. Another card that you could play, and it's 5 generic mana, so you could put this card in any deck you wanted to. It's not restricted based on color. And that card is Ugin's Nexus. Ugin's Nexus is a 5 generic legendary artifact. And it states, if a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. That's the first ability that it has. That's highly relevant against Brago players. It is more expensive. It is 5 generic now. It is 5 generic mana, so you're not restricted by color, which is good. But it's 5 generic. It's 5. Everything else I've said so far is 4 mana, and I've seen Brago decks loop their infinite turn cycle on turn 4. If you're playing better fast mana rocks, you could do it as early as turn 3, which is not what you want to see at casual level. If you're playing a CDH, Brago, whatever, stay at a CDH table. If you're playing a casual Brago, you should not be doing infinite loops on turn 4. You should not be taking infinite turns on turn 4, 5, 6, or personally even 7. If you're going to do, like, I'm taking infinite turns, give everybody till turn 8. A lot can transpire between your first turn and your 8th turn on an entire turn cycle. So that's the main thing that the Ugin's Nexus states is if a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. Now that ability affects you as well, whereas the Stranglehold that I just discussed does not affect you, but it's a red enchantment. Ugin's Nexus has a secondary effect just like the Stranglehold. The secondary effect of Ugin's Nexus states, if Ugin's Nexus would be put into a graveyard from the battlefield, instead exile it and take an extra turn after this one. So if for some reason somebody gets rid of the Ugin's Nexus, you get to be like, oh, by the way, since you got rid of my Ugin's Nexus, I'm going to take the next turn because I get an extra turn after this one. So, haha. However, once it's gone, they could then follow it up with extra turn spells and kind of like keep you out of the loop. So, again, it's good. It affects you not being able to take extra turns while it's in play. So they do have to deal with it. But if they destroy it, it specifically has to be destroyed because it has to go from your battlefield to your graveyard for the secondary effect to happen. If they play something that says, I'm going to exile that artifact, you don't get the secondary effect, which is no fun, but they have to. It's something that they have to waste a resource on. Now, the other thing, this is a little trickier, not very, very tricky, but it's a little more hubba baloo or whatever to have to worry about. And that is Brago's blinking things every time he deals combat damage to a player. So because he's blinking things, a card that doesn't see a ton of love anymore in Commander, at least not at casual level, it probably is still played heavily at the CEDH level, but you don't really see it at the casual level, is a card called Containment Priest. It's a white creature that costs 1 generic and a white, so it's only 2 mana. It has flash, so you can cast it at instant speed, so that's highly relevant. And it states, if a non-token creature would enter the battlefield and it wasn't cast, exile it instead. So if they're like, I'm going to Brago and then punch you for damage, unfortunately you can't wait to see what they're going to exile and then flash it in because you have to complete the entire exile and then come back into play ability before anything else would resolve. But when the trigger goes on the stack to exile, once they deal combat damage to an opponent, you could flash in the Containment Priest at that point, and then it's like, do you want to exile? Because if you do, all that stuff's not coming back. It's going to hit exile because you didn't cast it. And that's a great way to keep them from blinking their creatures. Especially the creatures that are like, I'm going to get back my Time Warp or whatever extra turn spells in their graveyard, or whatever, any spells in their graveyard. I think they still play Cyclonic Rift, so like blink your Archaeomancer. Okay, cool. Well, combat damage was dealt, ability on the stack. I'm going to flash in Containment Priest. Do you really want to blink anything? Because if you do, it's not coming back. So you're not getting anything back from your graveyard. Now, and again, that's a white creature with flash, so that's relevant because it's a creature and it sticks around. And the Brago is white-blue. There are exile effects in white, like Source to Plowshares and Path to Exile, which I think should be standard staple cards for anybody playing white in Commander. Blue doesn't really have exile. There's a couple at 1 mana. It's Pongify and something else. Rapid Hybridization, I think it is. Pongify and Rapid Hybridization are both 1 blue, instant speed, destroy target creature, and that creature's controller gets a 3/3. I think Pongify gives you a 3/3 ape, and I think the Rapid Hybridization gives you a 3/3 green-blue frog lizard. But it's a 1 mana, they give you a 3/3. Other than those 4 cards, Blue's only other removal to deal with things is predominantly bounce. Most likely in the form of a Cyclonic Rift, which they would probably overload just to kind of like not really have to worry about much. But they do have access to that. Something else that you could use if you're worried about them doing the blinky stuff, there's an instant speed spell in white as well. It's called Hallowed Moonlight. It's 1 generic and 1 white pip. It's an instant. It only costs you a total of 2 mana, and it says until end of turn, if a creature would enter the battlefield and it wasn't cast, exile it instead. And then the last portion is you get to draw a card. So again, you could wait for the Brago player to hit an opponent, ability on the stack, cast Hallowed Moonlight. It's going to prevent the Brago player from blinking anything for that turn that's a creature, and in the process, the Hallowed Moonlight's going to replace itself by letting you draw a card. So that's also a really good card to be able to deal with stuff. Another card you could play that's being played a lot, both in casual and I think also in competitive, is Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. It's 4 generic and a white. And so it's a 5 mana legendary white creature. But it states that if a permanent entering the battlefield would trigger an opponent's ability to happen, instead that ability doesn't happen whatsoever. It also states that if a permanent entering the battlefield would trigger one of your permanents to have an ability effect happen, that triggers an additional time. So you could have Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines in play. Brago could hit somebody. Sure, you can blink your creatures, your artifacts, whatever, but nothing's going to get an enter the battlefield trigger on your opponent's side of the board. It'll only give enter the battlefield trigger stuff to your stuff that triggers off of things coming into play. And it'll actually double those effects. So, like, if you had, what is it? One of the Soul Sisters creatures, one of the 1 mana white creatures that says whenever a creature comes into play, you gain 1 life or you may gain 1 life. I can't think of the name off the top of my head because there's several. But, like, if you have that and Elesh Norn and they Brago hit somebody and blink, you're going to gain 2 life for every creature they blink, and they're going to get no effects, which is really good. Unless, of course, you have Suture Priest. Suture Priest is a 2 mana 1, and it's a little different. It says if a creature coming into play under opponent's control would occur, you may have that player lose a life. So, if anything, if you have Elesh Norn, Mother Machines, Suture Priest, and they hit somebody with Brago and blink like 5 creatures, you can force them to lose 10 life. Which is pretty good. But essentially, the big stuff that you could play, like you could essentially play like a Jeskai control deck in Commander. It doesn't have a lot of ways to ramp other than playing Mana Rocks, but I feel like every deck should play some amount of Mana Rocks. Regardless, I personally build decks that play 40 lands plus Mana Rocks. So it's like I'm playing more than 40 lands. I know a lot of CDH decks play like 25 to 27, maybe 30 or 32 lands, but usually not more than like 33, and then they play like 10 super strong, cheap mana rocks. So it's almost like they've got 40 or 42 lands or something like that. But I also don't play the CDH stuff. I try my best to play casual or as casual as possible with the stuff that I prefer to play. So another card that's the other thing is all these cards are really good against Brago. They're also really good against other strategies as well, like other decks. Stranglehold is really good against my favorite commander, my favorite 2-color commander, I should say, is Momir Vig, Simic Visionary. He's a blue green creature. He's an elf, but he has an ability that states whenever you cast a green creature spell, you may search your library for a creature, reveal it, shuffle your deck, and put that creature on top. And then he has another ability that says whenever you cast a blue creature spell, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature, add that card to your hand. So cards like Stranglehold are gonna hurt me really bad because I can't cast a creature and search. I still get the look at the reveal the top card if it's a blue creature spell, but I can't if it's like if I have Momir in play and I cast a creature spell that's both blue and green. I can stack Momir's abilities to search first and then reveal, and I get the creature to my hand. So that's really nice. But if Stranglehold's in play, I can't search. I can only do the reveal. There are other cards as well that are problematic to the search mechanics. There's Aven Mind Sensor. It's 2 generic and a white for a flying creature. It's a 3/2, I believe. And it has flash, so you can play it at instant speed. But it states that while it's in play, if an opponent would search their library, they only search the top 4 cards. So you have to find what you're looking for in the top 4. So it doesn't take away the full search ability, but it does heavily limit what they can search. So that's also a problematic card. Again, it's a white creature. There's a couple other things here and there that can work. Aven Mind Sensor's good. I feel like Stranglehold's good. Decks that like to blink stuff. Also, that's another thing. So everything that I'm kind of telling you guys about right now is actually going to work for mostly two different deck styles. So the Plagiarize card that I said at the beginning, that's 3 generic and a blue. That's going to be really good against most Momir lists. Most of the Momir lists are going to win through most of the ones I've seen, at the very least. There are other ways to do it, but most of the ones that I've seen, not the one that I play, but the ones that I've seen that play on a more competitive tier, they're going to try to win through a Laboratory Maniac win, which is forcing yourself to draw a whole bunch of cards, more so than your library. So if they're going to draw a bunch of cards but not like completely deck themselves out, you can use Plagiarize against whatever effect they're using for that turn and draw all those cards instead. Some Momir lists, as well as the Brago list, and I think I've seen a couple of Chulane lists do this too. So that's another thing. Plagiarize is going to work fantastic against Chulane. For those of you that don't know, Chulane is 2 generic, a blue, a white, and a green for a legendary creature that says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card, and then you may put a land from your hand into play. Really good. Probably my favorite Bant commander because it cares about creatures, it cares about lands, and it gives you card draw. So every creature becomes a semi-refill your hand. Like if you're looking at your hand and you're like, I have 6 lands and 1 creature, and you're like, I have a ton of mana, and you've got Chulane in play, you play that creature, you draw a card, let's say it's another creature. Well, now you also get to put a land from your hand into play. You could in theory, turn your 7-card hand with 1 creature and 6 lands in it in 1 turn with Tulane in play into a hand that no longer has lands, that has relevant cards that may not necessarily be creatures or might be more creatures, and then you've every creature spell was a draw that potentially ramped you. And that's always a positive. So things like Play Drives will work against that. But there are Tulane lists, very few Tulane lists, but there are some Tulane lists. There's a lot of Momir Vig lists that are going to win through Laboratory Maniac. Brago King Eternal wins through blinking stuff to take extra turns. So Stranglehold, Ugin's Nexus is going to prevent the extra turn cycles. Plagiarize is going to help prevent any extra draws if they're playing a bunch of artifacts that help do extra draws. Hallowed Moonlight and Containment Priest are going to help prevent the blinking of creatures from Brago's ability. And Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, is going to help prevent any enter the battlefield effects that they are using on their creatures whenever their creatures blink out and come back in. Another card you could use in any of the decks that play white against Brago King Eternal, Tulane, and Momir Vig. I really don't like seeing this card, but I understand it's highly relevant. And that card is Linvala, Keeper of Silence. Linvala, Keeper of Silence is a legendary white creature for 2 generic and white that states, while it's in play, your opponents can't use any activated abilities of creatures they control. That's not going to stop Momir himself, but most of the Momir lists that I see running around online play a whole bunch of mana dorks. So Llanowar Elves, Arbor Elves, these elves that tap for mana, that tap to gain you life or whatever. Brago King Eternal might play some creatures that do that. Tulane plays mana dorks like crazy to have your best chance with Tulane, because most of the mana dorks that you would play in Tulane are cheap, so they're going to replace themselves and potentially ramp you. So Linvala, Keeper of Silence is just highly relevant against all of these decks. Momir Vig and Brago King Eternal both also definitely Brago King Eternal, because it doesn't have access to the kind of ramp spells that Momir would have access to. But there's quite a few Momir lists also that a lot of the ways that you would ramp is through playing the artifact mana rocks like Soul Ring and stuff like that, and Arcane Signet. So another card that you could play, and this is a green card. Not a fan of seeing this one either, but I'm more okay with this than I am Linvala, just because of I like creatures and I like my creatures to be able to do stuff, and Linvala is kind of annoying. And that is Collector Oof or one of the Karn Planeswalkers. So the Collector Oof is 1 generic and a green, and it says while it's in play, players can't activate abilities of artifacts. Period. So that includes you. There is a Karn Planeswalker that's 4 generic mana who has a static ability that does the same thing, except I think it says opponents can't activate abilities of artifacts. So it prevents players from being able to use their Soul Rings, Arcane Signets, all that fun stuff. So against Momir Vig and Brago King Eternal, both of these cards are just going to be like, oh, you played some early game Mana Rock ramp. That's cool. What if you don't have it? What if you just don't have it? That sounds good, right? And the Karn Planeswalker is 4 generic mana, so that could go in any deck, regardless of color. Brago King Eternal does heavily, from what I've seen. I don't know all the lists. I don't know how heavily it cares on the CEDH level. I do know he's one of the few Azorius-colored commanders that cares about beating people's face in, that tries to go infinite turns. So I don't know how heavily it cares about artifacts. But if it cares heavily enough and you're playing red, you could also play cards like Shatterstorm and Vandal Blast. So Shatterstorm is a red instant or sorcery. I'm not completely positive. I guess I could look it up, but I don't feel like it. That states destroy all artifacts that are in play. Just destroy all artifacts that are in play. So it'll hit all their mana rocks, anything else that they've got that's sitting there that's not a mana rock, but it's an artifact. Momir Vig doesn't have to play as many artifact mana rocks, but it plays enough that Shatterstorm could be relevant. Vandal Blast is 1 red, destroy target artifact and opponent controls. Or for 4 generic and 1 red, you can overload it. The overload ability replaces every instance of target within the wording of the text with the word each. So instead of saying destroy target artifact and opponent controls, it would, with the overload cost, it would say destroy each artifact and opponent controls. So it'll leave your artifacts alone, but it'll blow up everybody else's for 5 mana instead of 1. Shatterstorm, I know, is 4 mana. It's like 2 generic red. If you're playing Selesnya, which is green-white, if you're playing Selesnya and you don't want to see all these artifacts or enchantments, this is also a really good card for, like, Enchantress decks. The problem with Enchantress decks is they're almost always green-white, maybe plus another color, but it's almost always green-white. If there is a third color, it's green-white plus. And the card, and this is actually probably one of my favorite Selesnya cards to combat artifact decks, enchantment decks, all that fun stuff, because it's gonna do 2 things with 1 effect, which is relevant. So it's 2 generic and then 3 hybrid green-white symbols. So it'll cost 5 mana. But the effect is destroy each artifact and enchantment in play. Then gain 2 life for each permanent destroyed this way. So for 5 mana, you're going to blow up all the artifacts and enchantments, but you're also going to gain 2 life for every one you hit. So if you play it, and between all players you hit 20 total things, you're going to gain 40 life. In Commander, life gain of 40 is relevant. Black players are going to have a harder time to deal with some of your stuff, just because most of the cycles of black stuff that I've seen that loop require them to pay life. So if you have far more life than they have, usually their loop is going to go yay far, and then they're going to stop until they can find a way to regain some of that health that they paid in to deal with some of your stuff. So Fracturing Gust is a really fun one that doesn't see play at all. Even when it was popular it really wasn't popular in Standard, now that I think about it. I really feel like Fracturing Gust is like a sleeper decent card for Commander against, like, if you're in green-white against, especially in Tulane. Like, Tulane should be playing this anyway, in my personal opinion. So Tulane's a deck that predominantly cares about creatures and lands. There are artifacts and enchantments that will help Tulane do Tulane things better, faster, and more consistently. But for the most part, it's play creatures, draw cards, get lands, punch people in the face. Or you should be punching people in the face. You might do a loop in Tulane that's like, I don't have to touch you ever, and I'm still going to win. But for the most part, punching people in the face. So I feel like Fracturing Gust is a good card in a Tulane list. Definitely something to hurt Brago King Eternal. It'll affect Momir Vig. It'll affect all the Enchantress lists. It'll another deck that Fracturing Gust could hurt. I'm kind of going like naming off cards that I feel like don't see enough play in Commander, that I feel like are relevant to certain deck archetypes. Ural the Miststalker is one of the favored, and I say favored, Voltron commanders. There are other Voltron commanders out there that are relevant, that hit hard, and they can hit fast. The reason Ural is unique among them is because Ural the Miststalker has hexproof. So can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. End of story. And he's in red, green, white. has an additional ability that states he gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to him. So he has a built-in Ancestral Mask. Ancestral Mask is a green aura that says enchanted creature gets +2/+2 for each other enchantment in play. So it doesn't count itself, but for every other enchantment in play, the enchanted creature gets +2/+2. And Ural kind of has that ability built into himself that cares about auras on Ural. So Fracturing Gust is a really good option against Ural. And if you let them load up on stuff on Ural and then try to kill somebody else, and then you're like, cool, my follow-up play, Fracturing Gust, now I'm going to gain a ton of life. That can be relevant. You take away all their auras, which makes Ural weaker, and then on top of that, you're going to gain a ton of life. So, these are the cards that I've looked into within the past 30-40 minutes, and cards that I've thought of off the top of my head that could work. The original focus was going to be on Brago, but as I spoke, more ideas popped in my head to just kind of talk about some of these other commanders that might be a blight if you're in a play group that plays these commanders. So again, effects that are going to be really good against Brago and Momer Vig are effects that make it so that you can't search or limit your search. There's another white creature. It's a Leonin. It costs a generic and a white, but it says players can't search their library at all. Any player can pay 2 generic on their turn to ignore the effect. So it'll affect all players, including yourself. But not being able to search libraries is like if you can get one of these cards out there that prevent people from being able to search their libraries, that's highly relevant, because one of the things that's played heavily in Commander, even at the casual level, are fetch lands. So if you have one of these effects in play, and they're like, "Oh, I'm going to play this fetch land," you're like, "Cool, you better not crack it." Maybe they're like, "Haha, I'm going to crack it," and you're like, "Cool, you pay a life, and you sacrifice that land, and then I have an effect here that says you can't search." So now you've done away with that, and you lost a life in the process, and you didn't get anything out of it. So all of these prevent search, make it so they can't search or prevent search effects, are relevant, highly relevant against specific decks like Brago King Eternal, and other decks that are going to play any black deck. The effects that say they can't search is probably going to be highly relevant, because black has a ton of tutors. Black literally is just I have a 1-mana card that says search my deck for any card I want, shuffle my deck, put that card on top. They've got several that for that mana cost say do this effect and lose 2 life. They've got Demonic Tutor at 2. I think they've got a couple of others at 2. There's Diabolic Tutor. You have to sack a creature as an additional cost, but it's basically Demonic Tutor. You search for the card you want, you shuffle your library, and you add that card to your hand. They've got Grim Tutor, Beseech the Queen. They've got a ton of tutors that will let them tutor for whatever they want and add that card to their hand. So effects that say your opponents can't search their libraries are highly relevant against black players. Anybody playing black decks. Predominantly mono black decks, because again, tutors are going to be copy number X bonus of whatever they're looking for. But not every black deck. Most mono black decks are probably going to play a whole bunch of tutors, but not every black deck that's black plus something is going to play a ton of tutors. So that's a whole bunch of relevant content that I went in. I kind of went fairly fast for this video, even though this video is almost 40 minutes long. I covered a bunch of stuff in detail, or tried to cover a bunch of stuff in detail. If you like the content, give me a thumbs up on the video. Again, subscribe, click the notification bell, leave some comments down below. Let me know if there's a particular archetype you want me to go over. Whenever random ideas pop in my head, if I've got time, or if for some reason, tonight, this morning, I'm not really able to sleep for whatever reason, it's in my head and I kind of just need to get it out of my head. Definitely, leave me a comment or something about like an archetype or a mechanic that you want me to look into and kind of like go over and discuss, and maybe like talk about different ways to help get around it or different ways to help deal with it depending on what the archetype or mechanic is. Some things are easier to deal with than others. Some things not so easy. But this has been another episode of Cardboard Kitchen, and I really hope that you guys like it. Thanks.